to the channel. In today's video, we're going to take care of several items. The goal is going to be to remove the sunroof, smooth out this quarter panel, and actually fill in the license plate holes on the front bumper. I'm going to try to clean that up because in our state we don't require front license plates, and I think it'll really clean up the front end because the holes that are in that bumper now are pretty large and kind of unsightly. So let's get started. Here are the holes I was talking about. They're pretty large for front license plate holes, maybe a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch in diameter. So I can't just take body filler and fill it in right here. I'm gonna have to flip this around and go from the inside. And what I'm gonna end up doing is taking some wire mesh and cutting it out to cover larger than the hole on each of these. And I'm gonna use that 3M panel bond and actually panel bond it to the back side here to basically have a backdrop to keep the panel bond from coming through the back. So once that sets up, I'll be able to flip it back over and then fill in the hole with that panel bond until it sets up. And once it sets up, I'll be able to sand it smooth and then apply any kind of final layer of glazing putty to smooth it out. So that's what I'm gonna get started on. Here's some wire mesh that I'm going to use. This is actually some stainless steel wire mesh that I picked up on Amazon. I'm going to link it in the description below in case you want to pick some of this up. It's just a roll of stainless wire mesh. I've actually got some shears here I'm going to use to cut this. Now that I have the squares, I'm going to use this 3M panel bond, and I'm just going to mix it up on this cardboard like I did last time, and then I will adhere these to the back of the side of the bumper. Just going to use a broken paint stick to mix this up. To help it stick to the back side of this bumper, I'm going to scuff this up with 80 grit sandpaper. I'm going to wipe it off with some alcohol. Now that that is dry, I'm going to lay these over the hole here. And I'm going to lay the epoxy on it and spread it over it. So that epoxy is going to take several hours to set up. So I'm going to go ahead and move back here to the passenger quarter panel and sand this epoxy down because it's been a day or two. So I'm going to use 80 grit on a dura block to get this knocked down to a rough shape of what I want, and then I'll move on to body filler. Alright, looks like we're ready for some body filler now. Since the spot we're getting ready to repair is a little bit deeper than some of the other spots we took care of with the glazing putty, I'm actually going to use this Evercoat Rage Gold body filler to fill it in because it will work better for a thicker repair than the glazing putty. Key thing with this is to really mix it up because it does separate over time when it sits. I'm going to use this small piece of cardboard. A lot of people will say not to use cardboard because it absorbs the filler and the materials in it, but it works just fine as long as you don't let it sit for a long time. You really want to mix up this hardener as well. It does separate too. There you go. You can see how it's kind of separated into a liquid. You really want to avoid adding air pockets in this body filler when you mix it up because that will add pinholes to your repair area and it'll make it more difficult to smooth out. You want to put on as little as possible because that just means you have to take off more if you put on too much. With the body filler set up, I'm gonna go ahead and sand it. I'm gonna step it up to 120 because I don't have to rough it up as much. I will probably have to do another layer or two, and probably gonna use the glazing putty after this to really refine the shape of this. So I've knocked it down enough to really get the shape of it. There's still some low spots in here, but that's exactly what I want because I'm gonna lay another layer of a glazing putty on top of here and really refine the shape and try to get it all smoothed out. I'm gonna use some alcohol here and clean the surface off and then get some body filler mixed up and throw it on. I'm gonna knock it down with 150 and then I'll move up to 320. Now that I got the passenger quarter all smoothed in, I'm gonna move over here to the gas cap and this epoxy. It's all set up, so I'm gonna knock it down and smooth it out and get it ready for primer. Alright, I've got this all cleaned up. I wiped it down with alcohol. I've got some etching primer now, so I'm going to mask off a couple of areas here and make sure I cover up all the bare metal spots with etching primer. That way the actual regular primer will stick to it. Here's the etching primer I'm going to be using. It's just a Rust-Oleum self-etching primer. You don't have to put it on real thick, you just want to cover up the metal. We're going to do the same thing right here. So the next step is to actually add some filler primer. This is just Rust-Oleum filler primer. I'm going to go over the etching primer and go a little beyond the etching primer on the scuffed up areas. Before I can use the filler primer on this area here, I'm going to go ahead and cover up the metal spots with the self-etching primer and let it dry. Now that the self-etching primer is dry, I'm going to go over it with a filler primer. Now that the epoxy is set up on the back side of this bumper, I'm going to go ahead and fill in these holes with some more panel bond on the front side, and we'll let that set up. I'm going to knock the edge of this door handle down with 320 because there are some chips here on the corners. Now that the body work is complete here, and I've got a coat of primer on here, I'm gonna throw a coat of guide coat, like black paint on here. That way when I sand it down, I'll know where high and low spots are, so I'll know what to repair. Now that the epoxy is cured, I'm going to put 80 grit on a dura block and block this down flat. Okay, now I'm going to move on to 20. You can see now that the holes are filled in and they are slightly below the surface of the bumper. That allowed me to skim coat it and get it perfectly flat. Alright, with our glazing putty now set up, I'm going to take 320 grit and flatten it out. So I'm going to move on and prepare these for primer. But before we can prime them, we actually have to put some plastic adhesion promoter on here. And before I do that, I'm going to use some wax and tar remover. This is just Rust-Oleum brand. This will get any oils that are on the surface off. That way the adhesion promoter can work and the primer will stick. Alright, now that that's dry, my next step is to use some adhesion promoter for the primer to stick. You don't want to lay this on very thick, you just want to kind of mist it on the bare plastic. So for the primer, I'm just going to use a Nason, the Select Prime 2K primer. It's a 2-part primer. You do 2 parts primer and then 1 part activator. I'm going to mix it up in the mixing cup here, and I'm just going to use the cheap Harbor Freight. I think this is like the $14 paint gun, high volume, low pressure gun. For priming, it works fine because you're going to be sanding all that primer down anyway. So that's what I'm going to use. When you use a 2K primer, like a 2K clear, you definitely want to use a respirator. So I went to the 2.5 mark on 2 to 1. I'm going to pour the activator in until I get to 2.5 here. Well, as you can see, we got a lot of the body work completed on the car. We got a lot of things primed in. We put guide coat on some of the smaller areas on the car that need to be blocked down. And we got the front and rear bumper sprayed with primer, so that's a huge step. Our next step here though on the bumpers are going to be to spray a layer of guide coat on it and take some blocks and start block sanding everything down and trying to get it all flat. Same thing on the car. We're going to keep doing that on the car, getting it flat. We may have to go back over it with some glazing putty or even another layer of primer until it's completed, and then we'll be one step closer to paint. We'll catch you on the next episode.